the snow had been pressing against the windows of Hatchard's back room for the better part of an hour when Vesper Aubrey heard the front bell sound, and with it, a voice that had no business being in a specialist imprint on a Tuesday afternoon in late November. She set down her pencil without hurry. She had been correcting proofs by lamplight. The third packet of the week, dense with German interlinears and a printer's compositor who could not distinguish between a long S and an F, and she had reached the particular state of concentration that made interruptions feel like small injuries. But the voice carried through the thin wall with the ease of a voice accustomed to carrying. And what it said made her set the pencil down with more care than she had intended. It asked for Mr. V.A. Croft. Vesper stood, smoothed her skirt once, and walked through to the front room wearing the expression she had spent 14 years perfecting. Attentive, professional, utterly unrevealing of the fact that Mr. V.A. Croft was herself. The man standing at the counter was perhaps 40, broad-shouldered in a dark wool coat, and he turned when she entered with the automatic precision of a man who always knows when someone has come into a room. She registered 3 things in the first 10 seconds, and she registered them without allowing a single one to reach her face. His coat had been cut by a tailor who did not serve publishers' readers. The collar alone told her that, and the way the wool fell at the shoulder told her more. His boots carried no ink, no chalk, no trace of the daily geography of a man who worked in print. And the line of his jaw, the particular angle of it in the lamplight, she had seen before, across a ballroom, 16 years ago, when she was 22 and briefly engaged to a man who had not yet understood that her father's fortune was smaller than rumored. She filed all 3 observations in the same interior drawer where she kept everything she had decided not to act on immediately, and she gestured him to the chair beside the work table. "Mr. Wickham," she said, using the name he had given in his letter. "I am V.A. Croft. Shall we begin?" He sat. He looked at her for a moment with the particular blankness of a man recalibrating. And then he opened his leather case and produced the first packet of Hungarian letters. And the recalibration was complete. Whatever he had expected Mr. V.A. Croft to be, he had decided, apparently, to set the expectation aside and proceed. The letters were extraordinary. Vesper understood that within the first 3 pages, she could read enough Hungarian to navigate the syntax, though her German was the stronger tool, and the interlinears he needed were German. And she felt the familiar, involuntary attention that came when source material was genuinely worth the work. The handwriting was a woman's, educated and expressive, and the voice beneath the formal courtesy of the period was dry and precise, and occasionally, surprisingly, funny. "She is describing a dinner party," Vesper said, pointing to the 3rd paragraph. "And she finds the hostess insufferable. She does not say so directly. She says the soup was excellent." Mr. Wickham looked up from the page he had been examining, and for the first time that evening he smiled. Not the careful social expression he had worn since he entered, but something quicker and less managed. "She always said that," he said. "When she found something unbearable, she praised the food." He stopped. A brief, almost invisible stillness passed over him, the stillness of a man who has said more than he intended. And then he looked back at the page. Vesper looked at the page too. She made a note in the margin. She did not ask who she always meant. They argued, before the lamp burned lower, over a transliteration method. She preferred the German scholarly standard. He had been using a looser phonetic rendering that she found imprecise, and he found more faithful to the spoken sound of the original. They reached a compromise that neither of them entirely liked, which Vesper privately considered a good sign. A collaborator who agreed with everything was useless. He shook her gloved hand at the door when he left, and she noticed one more thing, filed without expression, that he had kept his own gloves on throughout the entire meeting. A publisher's reader working indoors did not keep his gloves on. A man who wore a signet ring and did not want it seen did. She walked back to her work table, sat down, and looked at the first packet of letters for a long moment before she picked up her pencil again. Then she picked it up and went back to work. 3 weeks passed in the way that working weeks pass when the work is good, quickly and with the slightly unreal quality of time that is being spent rather than merely endured. Mr. Wickham came to Hatchard's on Tuesdays and Thursdays, arriving, Vesper noticed, consistently 7 minutes before the agreed hour, which was not the habit of a man to whom the meetings were merely professional obligation. He always had the previous session's pages reviewed, annotated in a small, precise hand that told her he had been at them in the evenings. He argued with genuine engagement and conceded when she was right, without the particular reluctance she had encountered in male colleagues who found concession to a woman's judgment difficult to manage. At their second meeting, his glove slipped, reaching across the table for a page, and for approximately 1 second, the signet ring was visible. The crest on it was a hawk above a chevron, and Vesper had seen that crest before. On the carriages drawn up outside the ballroom where she had danced once, with a young duke whose name she had known then and had not thought of since. She looked back at the page in her hand. She had her certainty by the 4th session, confirmed with the same quiet internal click she felt when a difficult translation finally resolved itself into the only English phrasing that could carry the original's full weight. She did not speak of it. She watched him instead. He was genuinely translating. That was the first thing she confirmed, and the most important. The work was real, his engagement with the text was real, and the grief that moved through him occasionally when a passage was particularly intimate. A grief he controlled quickly and thoroughly, but not before she had seen it, was real too. He treated Mr. V.A. Croft as an intellectual equal without hesitation and without the faint, effortful quality that accompanied men who were trying to treat a woman as an equal, and finding the attempt somewhat taxing. He simply argued with her as he would have argued with anyone whose judgment he respected, which she found, to her own slight surprise, more affecting than she had expected. On the afternoon of the 4th session, after they had resolved a particularly knotty problem with a passage that moved between Hungarian and German mid-sentence, he sat back in his chair and looked at the finished interlinear with an expression she had not seen on him before. Unguarded, and something very close to relief. She would have been pleased with that, he said quietly. He did not explain who she was. He did not look at Vesper when he said it. He was looking at the page, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has not been permitted to feel something for a very long time, and has just, in a back room in Bloomsbury, with snow on the windows, been briefly allowed. Vesper reached for her notebook and opened it to a fresh page. She made her decision in that moment, confirmed with a small, private smile she did not let him see, and she accepted the full scope of the commission. She had not had a collaborator who made her feel this way about the work in 14 years. She was not going to dismantle it by naming what she knew. The 5th meeting came on a Thursday in mid-December, and Mr. Wickham arrived with a second leather case rather than the first, and set it on the table with a care that told her it contained something different from what had come before. "There is a second packet," he said. He did not open the case immediately. "These are more personal than the first, more difficult." Vesper waited. He opened the case and placed the letters on the table. She could see at once that he was right. The handwriting on these pages deteriorated across the years in a way the first packets had not, moving from the educated, controlled hand of the earlier letters to something looser and more urgent. and the pages were worn at the edges, in the way that pages are worn when they have been read and reread many times by someone who needed them. She picked up the first page and read. She read for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking, and in those 2 minutes she understood something about the scope of what they were actually doing that the first packet had not fully revealed. These were not a gentleman's private papers assembled for posthumous interest. These were the recovered voice of a woman who had been deliberately silenced. A voice that someone, possibly several someones, had spent considerable effort and some years ensuring would not be heard. She set the page down. She used the formal phrasing she would have used for any professional inquiry, because the moment called for precision rather than comfort. "Who wrote these letters?" she asked. He looked at her across the table. He said a name, a woman's name, Hungarian, spoken quietly, as though he were testing whether the air of the room would receive it without taking it from him. His mother's name. He said it once, and then he watched her face. Vesper did not flinch. She reached for a fresh notebook, opened it to the first page, and wrote the name at the top in her clearest hand. "What are the dates of the earliest letters?" she asked. He told her. She wrote those down too. The work was no longer simply work. She understood that clearly, sitting in the lamplight with the snow still at the windows and the second packet open between them. She was being asked, by a man who did not yet know she knew who he was, to help restore a woman's voice to a record that had been arranged to exclude it. She looked at the name she had written at the top of the notebook page, and she thought of the expression on his face when he had said she would have been pleased with that, and she committed, without ceremony or announcement, to finishing what they had started. "We will need a separate organizational system for this packet," she said. "The letters should be arranged by year first, then by recipient. Do you have all of them, or are there gaps?" "There are gaps," he said. "I have been looking." "Then we will work with what we have," Vesper said, and turned to the first page. December moved through its short, dark days and carried them with it. The sessions accumulated their own domestic rhythm the way that regular meetings between people who are paying attention to each other always do. Tea poured without asking after the third session. The particular chair on the left of the work table understood to be his. Arguments conducted at a volume that occasionally caused the junior clerk in the front room to look up from his work. He brought a small branch of holly on Christmas Eve and set it on the edge of her desk with the announcement that Mr. Wickham was allowed sentiment, delivered in a tone that dared her to disagree. She placed it in the narrow vase she kept for her pencils, displacing the pencils to the windowsill, and did not comment. She did not throw it away when it dried either. It sat on her desk through January, brittle and faded, and she worked around it. The 10th meeting fell on a Wednesday, an unscheduled addition because he had found a problem in the 7th letter's German interlinear that he said could not wait until Thursday, and she had agreed, which told her something about herself that she filed alongside everything else. They had been at the page for 40 minutes, moving through a passage that resisted clean English with the particular stubbornness of language that carries its full meaning in its sound rather than its sense. When they reached a single word, the word was the Hungarian for yearning. "Yearning," Vesper said, pointing to it. "It has to be yearning. Want is too blunt. It flattens the whole line." "Want is what she meant," he said. She was not a woman who softened her words. She meant the physical fact of wanting something she could not have. Yearning sounds like poetry. "Yearning is not softening," Vesper said. "Yearning is want that has been refused long enough to become its own condition." That is exactly what she meant. She reached a point at the line, and he reached at the same moment to indicate the word. and their hands met on the manuscript page, 2 fingers touching the same Hungarian syllable, and neither of them moved. The argument continued. They finished it with their hands still resting on the word, she making her case, he making his, both of them speaking to the page rather than to each other. And they settled, jointly, on yearning. He wrote it in the margin, in his small, precise hand. She wrote it in her notebook. Neither of them mentioned that their fingers had not moved for the duration of the disagreement, and neither of them moved them until the decision was made. The sleet that night was hard and nearly horizontal, and when Vesper reached for her coat at the door, he stepped past her without comment, went out into it, hailed a hackney on the second attempt, spoke to the driver, and came back to the door to hand her up into the carriage. He paid the driver before she could speak. He stood on the curb in the sleet with his hat pulled down and watched the carriage pull away. And when Vesper looked back through the rain-blurred window, he was still standing there, watching it, as the sleet came down on his coat and his bare hands, and he did not move until the carriage turned the corner and she could no longer see him. She faced forward in the dark carriage and said nothing to herself. But she was aware, with a clarity that had nothing to do with analysis, that she had been looking back. The morning paper arrived with Vesper's breakfast tray on a Thursday in late January, folded to the front page as her companion always left it. And Vesper read it over her tea with the particular half-attention of a person whose mind is already at the day's work. She reached the society column on the 3rd page, and she read the blind item there twice before she set the cup down. A ducal personage of distinguished lineage, the item read, had been observed in a series of unducal locations conducting what could only be described as unducal business with a publisher's reader of obscure repute. The implication was arch, and the amusement was clear, and the detail about the Bloomsbury booksellers was specific enough that anyone who knew the geography of the street could have identified the shop within the hour. Vesper sat with the paper for a moment, and then she set it down and thought carefully. Someone had been watching. The item was too specific for coincidence. The location, the timing, the description of the visits as regular rather than occasional. Someone had been watching long enough to establish a pattern, and they had sold what they knew to the column, and the column had run with enough to damage without yet naming. The rest would follow. It always did. She understood. Sitting at her breakfast table in Bloomsbury with the January light coming thin through the window, that she was now the person best positioned in London to either protect him or destroy him, because she was the only person who knew both halves of what the column was gesturing at. She was not going to destroy him. That was not a difficult decision. The question was how to protect him without revealing, yet that she had known who he was since October. She went to Strathaven House at 11 o'clock that night. She had never been to Strathaven House as herself, though she had passed it in carriages often enough to know the facade. She went to the servants' entrance and asked for Mr. Wickham, which she understood was a considerable thing to ask of a butler. And the butler's face performed a sequence of expressions that she found, in other circumstances, would have been genuinely entertaining. He fetched the Duke. James Carmichael arrived in his evening coat, still dressed from whatever engagement the night had held before this one, and he stopped in the doorway of the small sitting room where the butler had deposited her and looked at her with an expression that was entirely unlike any she had seen on him in the back room at Hatchard's. This was the registrar's face, the Duke's face, composed and careful and very slightly alarmed beneath the composure. "Miss Croft," he said. "There was a blind item in this morning's paper," Vesper said. She took the folded page from her coat pocket and held it out to him. "Someone has been watching the shop. This is the first item. There will be others." He took the page. He read it. Something shifted in his face that she watched him work to contain, and he sat down on the sofa, with the paper still in his hands, in the manner of a man who has sat down, because standing has become briefly unreliable. Vesper sat beside him. He looked at the paper for a long moment, and then he set it on the cushion beside him, and he reached for her hand and held it in both of his and pressed it against his forehead, and told her, in the voice she had not heard before, neither the careful Duke nor the warm Mr. Wickham, but something beneath both of them, who his mother had been. Her name was Erzsébet. She had been a mezzo-soprano from Pressburg, which was what the Austrians called Bratislava, and she had a voice that people who heard it once remembered for 20 years. She had married James's father against the wishes of everyone who had an opinion about the matter. And for a brief time, they had been happy. And then society had proved cruel in the specific and efficient way that English society could be cruel to a foreign woman of artistic profession who had married above her station. And his father, not a cruel man, simply a man who found the cost of defiance too high to sustain, had allowed the cruelty to proceed. She had spent the last years of her life in a house in the country that was comfortable and entirely isolated, and she had died 10 years ago. And her name had not been spoken once in public mourning, because the family had determined that mourning her would require acknowledging her, and acknowledging her would require explaining her, and explaining her would require the current Duke to take a position the Dowager had no intention of allowing him to take. He finished speaking. The room was quiet. Vesper was still holding his hand. She wrote letters, he said, all those years. She wrote them to friends she had had before the marriage, to musicians she had known in Vienna, to her sister in Pressburg. I found them after she died. I needed someone who could render them in English, someone who would treat them as what they are. Vesper looked at his profile. She thought about 14 weeks of watching his face when he spoke of the letters, the particular quality of attention he brought to a passage that was especially alive, the way he went still when a line moved him. She thought about the word yearning on a page, and two people's hands resting on it. She did not take her hand back. "The printer has the next section of manuscript," she said. "We should make certain it is secure before anything else appears in print." He looked at her then. Something in his face shifted. A small, quiet change, like a room gaining light from a source that has not moved. He said simply, "Yes, we should." Within 3 days of the blind item, the Dowager Duchess of Strathaven had summoned James and demanded an accounting of his recent movements, his recent associations, and the nature of his business with a Bloomsbury bookseller. James refused to give one. He did it with the precision his years in the Lords had taught him, brief, complete, and entirely without the quality of apology. And the Dowager, who was a woman of considerable intelligence and very limited sentimentality, recognized the refusal for what it was and changed her approach. She began making inquiries about V.A. Croft. Vesper learned of this from the senior partner at Hatchard's, a man named Alderton, who had worked with her for 9 years and who called her into his private office one afternoon in early February with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something between respect and concern. "A substantial donation was offered this morning," Alderton said, "in exchange for what the donor described as discretion regarding certain manuscripts currently in preparation." He paused. "I refused it. I wanted you to know that I refused it, and that I intend to continue refusing it. I also wanted you to know that the offer was made, because I believe you have a right to know who is moving against you." Vesper walked home through the cold afternoon and sat at her writing table for 20 minutes without writing anything. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a formal letter to Hatchards. The letter stated that V.A. Croft was herself, had always been herself, and that all future correspondence relating to her commissions and her editorial work was to be directed to Miss Vesper Aubrey at her Bloomsbury address. She signed it with her full name in her clearest hand, sealed it, and sent it with her companion's nephew before she could reconsider. 3 of her translation commissions were quietly withdrawn within the week. She had expected this. She sat with the letters of withdrawal, polite, brief, without explanation, and felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has made a decision they knew would cost them and is discovering that the cost is real. At their next working session, she told James what she had done. She used the same plain tone she would have used to report a change of postal address. The commission from the Bavarian Text Society had been withdrawn, as had the 2 French literary commissions, and she was now working under her own name. James set down his pen. He looked at her across the work table for a long moment, a different look from any she had received from him before. Not the engaged attention of a collaborator or the careful warmth of a man who was keeping something back, but something more direct and more difficult to receive. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," Vesper said. "I did it because the pseudonym was becoming a problem, not because of your situation specifically. The Dowager's inquiry simply accelerated a decision I had been considering." This was approximately half true. He appeared to understand that it was approximately half true, and he did not press it, which she appreciated. He asked instead whether she was frightened. She said she was not. This was also approximately half true. What she felt was not precisely fear. It was the particular sensation of having removed a structure she had built carefully over many years, and standing in the open air where it had been, aware that the cold was real and that she had chosen it with full understanding. She had not been frightened. She had been deliberate. The distinction mattered to her, even if the difference from the outside was invisible. "The Dowager will not stop," James said. "No," Vesper agreed. "But she is working through channels that require my cooperation or Hatchard's cooperation, and she has neither. What she cannot do is reach the manuscript directly." She paused. "Can she?" He was quiet for a moment. "She does not know where it is held." "Good," Vesper said. "Then we keep it that way." 6 days before the society column was set to name her publicly, Vesper's companion's nephew came to the house at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and a piece of information that changed the shape of the day entirely. The Holborn printer who held the current section of manuscript had been approached, the nephew said, by a man who had offered £50 for the name of the manuscript's source and the nature of its subject. The printer had not accepted. But he had not, the nephew added carefully, refused. £50 was a great deal of money to a Holborn printer. Vesper dressed without hurrying, because hurrying would not make the streets shorter, and walked across London in the grey, early cold to retrieve the proofs herself. The city at that hour was a different city from the one she usually inhabited. Carters and coalmen, and a woman selling hot pies from a basket at the corner of Holborn, her breath visible in the cold air, her voice carrying through the quiet street. Vesper walked quickly and thought about the most efficient route, and did not permit herself to think about what happened if she arrived too late. She arrived at the printer's shop in Holborn to find James already there. He was standing in the doorway with his coat pulled close and no hat, which told her he had left wherever he had been without full preparation. And he turned when he heard her footsteps on the cobblestones, and looked at her with an expression that was, for one unguarded second, pure relief, followed immediately by something more complicated. They stood in the doorway in the gray morning cold and looked at each other. "You learned about the offer," Vesper said. Last night, James said. Through a man I employ to... I learned last night. You? This morning. My companion's nephew works at a press that knows this printer. She looked at him. You came alone? He said quietly. Yes. So did I. A brief silence occupied the doorway between them. She was aware, in the specific and unhurried way that she became aware of things she had been knowing for some time without naming, that they had been doing this for 4 months, protecting the same thing in parallel, through different channels, neither asking the other for help, converging now in the same cold doorway, at the same cold hour, because the same instinct had brought them both here. The instinct was not only about the manuscript. The printer was persuaded by James's manner and Vesper's precision and the combined effect of both, to surrender the proofs without further negotiation. They carried them into the back room, where the printer left them alone with the pages spread on the work table and the smell of ink and cold paper in the air. And it was there, standing on opposite sides of the table with the proofs between them, that James told her the truth. He did not begin with an apology. He began with his name. His actual name, spoken plainly, the title following it, without emphasis. And then he told her everything in a single, unbroken account. The way a person speaks when they have been holding something for a long time and have finally decided to set it down, regardless of what happens when it lands. He told her about his mother's letters and the years it had taken to gather them. He told her about the decision to work anonymously. The title would have made it impossible. The family would have moved against it immediately. The dowager would have found a way to prevent publication before a single page was set. He told her about the name Wickham, borrowed from a man he had been at school with who had gone to India and was unlikely to object. He told her he had not known. When he wrote to Hatchard's requesting a specialist translator for the German interlinears, that V.A. Croft was a woman. He told her he had understood very quickly that it did not matter, and that this understanding had surprised him. He told her what the 4 months had meant. He said it plainly, without the careful management he usually applied to things that mattered. That he had spent 8 years performing a version of himself that had nothing to do with the person his mother had known. And that sitting in a back room in Bloomsbury, arguing about the correct English rendering of a Hungarian word, was the first time in those 8 years that he had felt like the same person who had stood at a graveside 10 years ago and not been permitted to weep. He stopped. He looked at her across the table. "I am asking your forgiveness," he said, "for a kindness I dressed as a lie." The anonymity protected the work. It also meant I could be someone who was not required to be anything other than useful to you. I was not honest about who I was. I am sorry for that. Vesper looked at him across the printer's table, with the proofs of his mother's letters spread between them and the cold morning pressing at the small window, and she told him she knew. She told him plainly, without performance or preamble, that she had known since October, that she had recognized him at their second meeting from a ball she had attended at 22. When he was a young duke she had danced with once and had not thought of since, and that she had placed the crest on his signet ring against that memory within the first 3 sessions and arrived at certainty by the 4th. He went very still. "I let it continue," she said, "because your face, when you spoke of your mother, was the face of a man who had not been permitted to grieve. I was not going to take that from you by naming what I knew. And because..." She paused, not for effect, but because the next part required the kind of accuracy she applied to a difficult translation. "The lies sheltered me too. For the first time in my professional life, I was being treated as a mind rather than managed as a circumstance. I did not want it to end. James sat down on the stool beside the table. He sat down with the sudden quality of a man discovering that his legs have made a decision without consulting him. "You let it stand," he said. "I let it stand," she said, "because the lie was the truest thing you had said in years." He looked at her for a long time. The printer's shop was entirely quiet, except for the distant sound of the street outside and the small sounds of a cold building settling around them. 14 weeks, he said. 14 weeks, Vesper confirmed. And you said nothing. Neither did you. Something moved through his face then. Not the Duke's face, not Mr. Wickham's face, but a third thing, neither performance, simply a man sitting in a cold room in the early morning, with the truth finally on the table between them. He reached across the proofs and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the page. They sat on either side of the printer's table and told each other the rest of it. She told him about the broken engagement at 22, the man who had withdrawn when the money proved smaller than rumored, and the 16 years she had spent constructing a life that required no one's permission and therefore offered no one a handhold. He told her about the 8 years of the title, the precision of the silences in the Lords, the estate managed with the part of himself that was competent and reliable and entirely unrelated to grief, the night his mother's last letter had arrived after her death, and he had read it alone in a room in Strathaven House, and understood that she had died, still hoping he would find a way to say her name in public. The morning light shifted through the small window as they talked, moving from gray to the thin white of a winter morning fully arrived. When they finally rose from the table, they carried the proofs together, one on each side of the stack, and walked out of the printer's shop into a Holborn street that was now fully awake around them. 2 days after the printer's shop, they walked the frozen riverside path at Richmond at dawn. There were no horses, no carriages, no other figures on the path at that hour. Only the river, the ice at its edges, their breath visible in the cold air, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to a winter morning before the world has properly committed to the day. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Vesper told him about the broken engagement in full. Not the summary she had given in the printer's shop, but the particular details of it. The man's name, the drawing room where it had happened, the precise phrasing he had used when he withdrew, which had been courteous and final and had contained, she understood only later, a faint note of relief. She told him about the 16 years that followed, the careful architecture of a life built for one person, the way she had grown, gradually, genuinely proud of what she had made, and the way that pride had coexisted, quietly, with a settled distrust of her own judgment about men that she had not fully named, until she found herself spending 14 weeks watching a duke pretend to be a publisher's reader and choosing not to say so. "I did not see the first man's coldness until it was public," she said. "I thought, for a long time, that the lesson was not to trust what I saw in men. It took me rather longer to understand that the lesson might simply have been not to trust that particular man." James had been walking beside her with his hands behind his back, listening with the quality of attention she had first noticed in the back room at Hatchard's, complete, unhurried, entirely free of the impulse to offer solutions. He stopped walking. "I would like to court you," he said. "Miss Vesper Aubrey, by your own name, in my own name, in full daylight, for however long you require, with no anonymity and no management and no version of either of us that is not the actual person." He paused. "I am asking plainly because I find I am no longer able to ask otherwise." Vesper looked at him, standing on the frozen river path in the early morning light, his breath visible in the cold air, his expression entirely undefended. Neither the Duke's careful composure nor Mr. Wickham's warmth, but the thing she had seen in the printer's shop, the face of a man who has decided to stop performing. She kissed him. Once, slowly, with the deliberateness of a person making a decision they have considered from every angle, and have chosen not because it is safe, but because it is right. His hand came up to her face, and the cold air was sharp around them, and the river moved quietly at the edge of the path. When she drew back, she looked at him for a moment, and then she turned and resumed walking. He fell into step beside her. Their breath rose together into the cold morning air. James told the Dowager that week, in the same brief and complete manner he had used to refuse her accounting, that the book would be published, that his mother's name would appear on the cover, and that if the family chose to disown him for honoring a woman they had spent 20 years pretending had not existed, they were free to do so. The Dowager looked at him across the width of her drawing room for a long, measuring moment. Then she looked away. They did not, in the end, choose to disown him. Society, presented with a duke who declined to be ashamed of his mother's name and who had the particular advantage of being both solvent and in the Lords, found it could not quite afford to be ashamed on his behalf. The society column ran. Vesper was named. 3 more commissions disappeared in the week that followed, politely, without explanation, in the way that withdrawal always happens when the people withdrawing wish to avoid the appearance of having done anything at all. She read each letter of withdrawal and placed it in the drawer of her writing table and did not allow herself to spend more than 5 minutes in the company of any one of them. Within 2 months, 2 new clients had written to her at her Bloomsbury address specifically because of the column. One was a female poet who required a translator for her correspondence with a German publisher. The other was a women's literary society that wanted a lecturer on the practice of translation as a scholarly discipline. The market she had not known she had turned out to have known about her for some time. 6 months later, the back room at Hatchard's held a desk with a card fixed to the front of it that read, Miss Vesper Aubrey, editorial reader and translator. The card was new. The desk was the same one she had worked at for 9 years. But the card changed it, in the way that naming a thing changes it without altering its substance. On the desk sat the finished book, Letters from Pressburg, by Erzsébet Karolyi, Duchess of Strathaven, edited and translated by V.A. Croft. The binding was dark green, modest and correct, and the pages inside were clean and closely set. And the voice in them was the voice Vesper had spent 6 months learning to carry from one language into another, without losing what made it irreplaceable. The dry precision, the occasional unexpected humor, the quality of a woman who had loved and grieved and found the soup excellent when she could not say anything else. James was reading the final proof aloud, seated in the chair to the left of the work table that had been his chair since November. And Vesper was correcting his correction in the margin of her copy, with the small, contained satisfaction of a person who has been right about a comma for 6 months and is now officially recording the fact. "You are correcting my correction," he said without looking up from the page. "Your correction introduced an ambiguity that the original does not contain," Vesper said. "I am removing the ambiguity." He read the passage again. He set down his pen. He looked at the page for a moment, and then he looked at the cover of the book on the desk between them. And he said his mother's name once, quietly, in the Hungarian she had spoken all her life. He said it the way she had heard him say it in the printer's shop. Neither performance nor management, simply the sound of a name that had not been permitted to be spoken for too long, finally spoken by a person who had earned the right to say it plainly. He reached over and extinguished the lamp. The following morning, the light came through the curtains of Vesper's own room in Bloomsbury, in the particular thin gold of a summer morning. And it fell across the chair where his coat was folded, and across the small table where 2 cups of tea sat on a single tray, still steaming, and across the nightstand beside the bed where a small velvet box had appeared at some point in the night, dark blue and square and closed. Vesper's hand reached for it.